Yate, Shio, hello, and a warm welcome to the 20th speaker series, A Sense of Place, Indigenous Perspectives of Land, Water, and Sky. Today, we are very honored to host Dr. David G. Lewis, a professor of anthropology and Indigenous Studies at Oregon State University, and a member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Tribe. He's also the author of Tribal Histories of the Willamette Valley in Oregon. This is a fairly new book that's come out, and I urge you to take a look at it. You'll be very excited about this by the end of this session. This series is hosted by the Indigenous Education Institute. Today's session is supported and funded by the National Science Foundation project Lifeways, which means learning in and from the environment through multiple ways of knowing. And in our case, multiple ways of knowing is referring to Indigenous traditional knowledge. It is also supported by NASA HEAT, the Heliophysics Educational Activation Team, led by Dr. Michael Kirk. My name is Dr. Nancy Maryboy, and I am from Setlagay des Ah, which is White Rocks, Utah, and the San Juan Islands. I'm Diné, Navajo, and Salagi, Cherokee. My Diné Navajo clans are B. Batwoni, the Deer Springs clan, and Sinjakini, the Cliff Dweller clan. My Cherokee name is Tsawayuga, and I'm from, as I said, the Cherokee Bird Clan. I'm an affiliate professor in the Department of Environmental Studies and Forestry at the University of Washington. I'm also the founding president and executive director of the Indigenous Education Institute, which has been in existence for almost 30 years. We are located in the San Juan Islands of Washington State and on the Navajo Nation. IEI, the Indigenous Education Institute, is an all-Indigenous institution with a mission of preserving, protecting, and applying traditional Indigenous knowledge today. I would like to begin today with a heartfelt acknowledgement of the Indigenous peoples of our Mother Earth, to honor our many participants from around the world. I also want to acknowledge that I currently reside on the ancestral lands of the saltwater salmon people of the Salish Sea in Washington, who have called this place home since time immemorial. I also honor the inherent and acquired treaty rights of these Indigenous peoples. The presentations in this series have been chosen to reflect an awareness of the foundations of traditional Indigenous thinking and living. In our native ways, everything is interconnected. So rather than a specific focus on biology or history or anthropology or astronomy or other separate disciplines, we will be presenting Indigenous and dynamic worlds of interrelationships and processes of reciprocity. An additional focus for this speaker series is expanding awareness and understanding of cultural differences, and to support successful and diverse collaborative working relationships, whether it be at NASA HEAT, Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, the National Science Foundation, or in education, health, astronomy, national resource management, museums, science centers, or tribal communities. We work with all of these entities over the years. I want to personally thank you each for attending this webinar. The interest you have shown is heartwarming. We have over 530 people registered from all across the United States. And we have participants from all around the world, including many from Canada and others from Brazil, Guam, Mexico, South Africa, Austria, and the Central African Republic. It is also interesting and heartwarming for me personally that we have more than 100 different tribes represented in our registrations for this presentation today. We also have many classrooms and professors who have registered for this event, and many of them are using the recordings for their own curriculums. Before we continue, I would like to ask you to put any questions for the presenter into the question and answer box, the Q&A box, and not into the chat box. This will enable us to better serve you towards the end of this presentation. You're certainly welcome and encouraged to use the chat box, but put your questions in the question and answer box. We are honored to have Polly Walker, Dr. Polly Walker from, she is from, I'm going to say this wrong, probably Juniata College in Pennsylvania, asking the questions at the end of this presentation by Dr. Lewis. Okay, I would now like to introduce Dr. David G. Lewis. Dr. Lewis is a member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde in Oregon. He is a descendant of the, I might be saying this wrong and you can correct me, David, the Takelma, the Chinook, the Molalla, and Santiam Kalapuya peoples of Western Oregon. He has a PhD from the University of Oregon and is a full-time assistant professor of anthropology and indigenous studies at Oregon State University. Dr. Lewis served as the cultural manager of the Grand Ronde tribe and was the tribal museum designer and exhibits curation manager. He designed and opened the Chachalou Museum. He's been conducting research on Western Oregon tribal history for more than 25 years, with numerous publications in journals and books. He has published over 500 research essays on the blog site, the Cortex Journal. And Chris, you probably can put this in the end for reference, ndnhistoryresearch.com. That's ndnhistoryresearch.com. David's eye-opening book entitled Tribal Histories of the Willamette Valley was published in 2023 by Ooligan Press. To the best of my knowledge, it is the first and only book that tells the authentic stories of the various tribes of the Willamette Valley from a tribal perspective in terms of the settler colonialism and the tribal histories of the valley. And now it is my very great honor to present Dr. David Lewis. David?
Thanks, Nancy. Let me get started here. I wanted to say thanks for inviting me to this venue. This is actually at the end of what I call my Kalapuya World Tour, because I did about a year presenting on my book, about 70 to 80 presentations overall. So I'm getting pretty good at it. So I've had a lot of practice. Let me share my screen here and get going on this. All right, so clean up my screen a little bit. Okay, so let me get this going. All right, you should have one screen. If you have two, let me know, and I know something's wrong. All right, so first off, I understand there's quite a few people in the audience, maybe about 500 people. So I don't know if you know much about Oregon, but we have a place in Oregon called the Willamette Valley. And this valley is pretty well settled and what I call colonized, and we'll get more into that story later. But let me first introduce the Kalapuya people. Oh, here's my book. Sorry, if you haven't seen it yet, here's the cover. It was published last year, about a year ago. The cover is actually designed by a native artist, Greg Robinson of the Chinook Nation. And so if you wanted to get a piece of his art, he does have a site online, which I don't really have the link to right now, but you could probably find it online easy. Just look up Greg Robinson, Chinook artist, and then you could probably find it easy. But he does sell prints of his work. It's pretty good. Okay, so first, here are some of the tribes in the area. This is only the tribes on the Columbia that are in the Chinookan territory. I usually bring up this slide to show people how the diversity of tribal nations in our area. The Chinookan peoples were not just one tribe; they were multiple tribes, sometimes intermixed with and next to near neighbors with other tribes, other languages, as we all know. We see this area is essentially Southwest Washington, Northern Oregon, and as far east as the Deschutes area of Oregon. And all these tribes mentioned, the Wasco, Wishram, Cascades, Multnomah, Clatsop, lower band of Chinook, and Willamette Bay, Shoalwater Bay were all Chinookan speaking nations. Excuse me. So this shows a great diversity. This is a diversity around 1851 when tribes initially signed treaties with the federal government, and while those treaties were never recognized, it does give us a record of the nations that were in existence at the time. Moving on down south, we have the Kalapuya nations, which will be the main one we talk about today, Kalapuya area, which were in the Willamette Valley. So the Kalapuya and Molalla were the principal tribes of the valley. The Molalla occupied the east side, the Kalapuya the central and west side, into the Umpqua Valley. So the good number of tribal peoples there, and that's my principal lineage from the Santiam, right in the center of your picture right here. So the initial population estimates for our people were around 15,000 to 20,000 people before disease took hold. And then moving even further south of that, we have the Umpqua and Rogue valleys of southern Oregon, southwestern Oregon. And there were 5 different languages spoken in the Umpqua Basin, non-intelligible, non-dialectical languages, including Kalapuyan. And then down in the Rogue area, we had 2 languages, the Shasta and the Takelma language, Takelma was another one of my ancestries, and maybe some Athabascans thrown in there. And so they're all interrelated peoples, all always interrelated because all the tribes always married together anyway, as we all know. And then showing a larger piece of the Oregon Territory, there were probably 100 to 150 tribes in this area, if not more, maybe 200, going back further in time. But the vast diversity is on the west side, where there's a lot more rain, really sort of lush, almost tropical environment, what they call a Mediterranean environment in some ways, and so we're going to concentrate most of our talk today in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. All right, so the Kalapuyans have a very long history. We have at least 2 oral histories of the people escaping huge floods that came into the valley, and I attribute them to perhaps stories of the Missoula floods that came through between 16,000 and 11,000 years ago. Scientists suggest that dozens, if not hundreds, of floods came through the valley at various times, some very large. And this story here talks about the tribe people running. If you look in the center here, running to the top of a big mountain they call Mary's Peak now, and the water pretty much not got to the top of the mountain. This may be a little bit of exaggeration, but very very high. The water did not recede well, and then it took a while for it to recede back into away from the land. And so, if this happened numerous times, we have at least 2 stories that talk about this kind of event. Then I believe much of the valley was changed by the addition of all those Missoula flood soils and perhaps plants and other things that were brought with it. But it also really shows us that we have a very long history here, at least 16,000 years in terms of our stories alone, which actually predates the archaeology of the area. So Much of our context then is below the flood soils, which is not where somewhere that archaeology really goes yet right now. So that's so the longer context. We are one of the older tribes in the area. The Calapooians are. We also have these calendars that were collected by anthropologists back in the 19th century. This is one that's from the Tualatin. Albert Gatchett came through the Grand Ronde Reservation and collected this 12-month calendar, and he even got the names of the months, which I can't even pronounce really well, because they're in Calapooian and the language is now considered extinct. But there is a translation of what these things are, and at least 4 months of the year, the Calapooians were out getting a root called camas, which many of you probably know very well. And then at least 3 to 4 months of the year, they're also harvesting another root called wapato. And wapato is a pretty common, again, staple in the area, and especially the West Coast, and I think throughout the Americas. We do grow it in much greater quantities, it seems like in the Willamette Valley and on the lower Columbia, than many of the places in the United States, because our conditions are very good water, very good soil, very good sunlight, and so it grew in very vast quantities in the area of what's now Portland, Oregon. So they spend a good portion of their year, according to this calendar, actually harvesting plants. Hunting is barely mentioned once on here. Fishing is not mentioned at all. Calapooians, even though they're in technically the Chinook salmon area of the Northwest Coast, and they had Chinook, they did have fish, and they did hunt quite a bit. They didn't really have to depend on that. They actually depended more on their plant life, I believe, than most other things. They could hunt anytime because we had plenty of hunting, plenty of elk in the area. And then if they needed the fish, they could go up to tribes in the north on the Columbia that had more fish connected with fishing falls. And they could trade their vast amounts of camas and wapato that they had already harvested and prepared salmon, dried smoked salmon, they got from the Chinook tribes. So this is some of the understandings I've gotten out of this calendar over the years, of looking at it, taking me time sometimes to understand what it's telling me. But it's actually very, very informative as to the life way of the tribes, of the Calapooia tribes. These are some of those plants I mentioned. You've probably seen these plants before. We have wapato here on the left side, a very good tasting, what they call Indian potato back in the day. And then we have camas on the right side and the center. Camas grows in huge amounts, or used to grow in huge amounts in our plains, our fields in the Valley. And it peels down to a nice white bulb that can be either slow cooked underground, or boiled in a basket for food. And nowadays we have modified that slightly, perhaps cooking them in a slow cook in the oven or in a crock pot. But it's the same thing really. But those are the major staples in our area. That's the basis of the whole Calapooia calendar. Uh, Hunting again is not well mentioned, so they didn't really have to plan for that. They could do that anytime, I believe. So here I put together what appears to could have been the seasonal round for the tribes, the annual, encampments that they would have. They would have root camps. They would go after weeding materials, berry camps in the midsummer, acorn camp camps at the end of the summer. Sometime in this area, they would have a fire, usually between August and September. It would set fire to the prairies. In the midst of this, they're still having weaving materials camps, fall salmon, hazelnut camps about this time of the year, and then hunting camps in the wintertime too. So in the meantime, all the extra food that they gathered throughout the year, the camas, the berries, wapato, biscuit root, anything else they had gathered in prodigious amounts and dried up, they would store underground and then take out in the wintertime to be rehydrated and turned into food for the people. So where it's cold enough in Oregon that people would stay inside in their plank houses for much of the year, much of the winter, I mean, and probably 3 to 4 months of the winter they would be inside, not going outside because it's very cold. Nowadays it's less cold. I think we're clearly in a warming period in the earth in this area, and so they don't. It is warmer than it used to be, but 100 years ago, 100, 200 years ago, it was very cold in the wintertime, and even the rivers would freeze over. Unlike today, where I rarely see a river frozen over at all in this area. So that's kind of their lifestyle, and they went through that lifestyle for hundreds, if not thousands of years in this area. We see Camas really developing as a cultural phenomenon in about 7,000 years ago under archaeological evidence. And I wonder, and I have wondered for a while, if the Missoula floods brought things to the valley here they didn't have before. How did it change? I wonder how the floods changed the valley, perhaps modified it to make it better for Camas, better for Wapato, perhaps even brought some seeds with it and plants and animals with it, and sort of create a whole new environment after 11,000 years ago. And that's a question that we still have. We still haven't done all the research on, but let me move on. Colonization begins really in around the 1820s, 1830s. We see missionaries coming into the area 1830s and beginning to prepare the area for settlement, sending word back to the east coast that there's this awesome place, the Willamette Valley, that looks like it's clear of people. And the reason why it looks like it's clear of people is because we had this massive epidemic that came through called we call it the malarial epidemic. Malaria is brought here by fur traders that went through the tropics and brought malaria in their bodies back to the area. And our mosquitoes in this area, the Anopheles type mosquito, picked up that malaria and transferred that to, or became the vector for that to the native populations. And so we died out here to the tune of, at most, about 97% of our people in most villages died out. And so we see after around 1830, much of the Western Oregon depopulated. And then when missionaries move here, they do see that there's all these nice clear fields. They didn't realize they were all prepared by the native people over hundreds of years, but there was almost no native people, so it was a clear and open area for settlement. And so we see then a lot of Americans come to Oregon to settle the Willamette Valley. They take very large amounts of acreage for their own. And we also see tribes move into the area too. We see tribes like the Cowlitz and Klickitat come into the valley and begin to claim areas of the valley as their own. So that is actually the big change that comes to our people. We have to then begin to adapt to these new cultures, the American cultures coming at us, begin to learn the lessons of farming, of agriculture, and begin living that lifestyle in order to survive. So settlers took our lands and they didn't take small amounts, they took large amounts. Under the Donation Land Claim Act, they were able to take a mile square parcel for a family. That's 640 acres for a family, and they only had to wait 5 years to prove up on it. So the tribes, because they're not Americans, were not allowed to take land like that. There was no process in place for them to sort of like become Americans and claim land. They were just considered savages, and they were pushed to the margins of the white settlements in the valley. They actually did help. They did work for the settlers. Many of them became good farmers and good tenders of their own herds, while they could. And they were modifying their economy to this new American economy, but because they were native, they were not welcome and were pushed to the margins and were called vagrants and thieves because of that. In that period, the federal government began working on plans to buy the land from the tribes through treaties and eventually move people to the Grand Ronde Indian Reservation. All the Calapuyans from all our records suggest they all went to the Grand Ronde Reservation. All of the governments from the tribes went to the reservation, nowhere else. And at the reservation, because of some of the treaties were ratified, the government began putting into place effect many of those policies in the treaties of getting the adults to become farmers, of getting the children to go to school, and being putting missionaries among the tribes on the reservations. And these three things are all assimilation practices, making native people who had never farmed before become farmers as their primary profession and not allowed to leave the reservation, and then making the kids go to school at first through day schools at the reservation, later on in boarding schools like our Catholic boarding school at Grand Ronde, and then forcing them to become civilized by being subjected to missionaries and becoming Christians in some respect, was the overall plan. And I think largely the plan worked. It took some time, but by the 20th century, we see most people on the reservation pretty well colonized. They are Catholic by and large. They're sending their kids to Catholic boarding school. Many of the kids are being sent to other boarding schools like Chemawa or Sherman or somewhere. And they are they're looking forward to being farmers in the new economy. They don't realize, though, at the time that farming was actually going downhill. At the time, most individual farmers that were non-native couldn't make a living with very little acreage, and at the most, the tribal people at the reservation only had 240 acres for each family. So there was no way they could actually make a living in the American economy. They could only just barely survive. The only thing that kept them going was non-paying of taxes. The tribes were eventually terminated in the 1950s under U.S. termination laws. All the Calapuyans, all the people at Grand Ronde, Siletz, and Klamath in Oregon were terminated, and so it took another 30 years or so for the tribes to be restored. In the meantime, me and other people like me have been doing work on the history of the tribes, restoration work, trying to recover what our history is like. And part of my work has been to look for more evidence of what our land was like, what our environment was like previous to colonization. Because a lot of what we're doing nowadays in the tribe and even outside the tribe in some private communities is doing decolonization activities like restoration. We're trying to restore lands, but right now we don't really know exactly what those lands were like because nobody collected the records of those things, and much of that, many of the people that were assimilated by boarding schools and basically lost their language, lost their knowledge of their culture and their history, also don't know anything about what the valley was like before. So we've had a lot of assumptions, and so the rest of this presentation is about what I've been finding as the original landscape of our valley and how things have been changed radically by settlers in the last 180 years. So let me get on to that. So in our valley, this is a view from a butte called Peterson Butte. We look out on the valley in the summertime and we see mostly these dry, arid fields for agriculture. And this is the whole valley. This is, besides a few large cities like Portland and Salem and Eugene, most of the valley looks like this. We have some rivers, lots of rivers, but most of it is dry, arid fields. And I've wondered, this I've lived in this my whole life, and only in the last couple of years has it occurred to me that this is not normal in any way. And that's because we have tons of rainfall here. And so where does all the rain go? Well, this is a image I found from before or around 1930 or so, before dams were built, before they put in lots of water management projects in the valley, before what's called the Willamette Valley Project was instituted. And it used to be when it rained in the valley, or we had these summer and winter storms, that this would happen. We'd see lots and lots of groundwater. We'd see water everywhere. It would flood, and there would be swales, and there would be marshes built up, and there would be ponding happening all the time. This no longer happens except for in maybe one or two areas of the whole valley. So it's much different today, as you've just seen. I initially came to this research by looking at a lake system pretty close to where I live today. I live in Salem, Oregon. So this lake is called Lake Labiche. It's north of Salem. It's a kind of a long lake, or used to be a long lake, and I had to go back to the 1850s General Land Office maps to find a map of the lake, and I put together the lake out of these two GLOs or three GLOs. And then here's the blue part is the central lake, and all these yellow areas are all of the swales that come off the lake, that are sort of wetland areas off the lake when it floods in the valley, which could happen all the time. In Oregon, we generally have rain all times of the year. It's not just a winter activity here. So it turns out through my research, I was trying to figure out what happened, because in my lifetime, we've never seen a wet Lake Labiche. It's always been a dry agricultural landscape. So I was wondering what happened. And so it turns out what happened is the farmers, and you see these early plots in the 1850s, these fields being put near the lake, wanted to build their inventory of land up into these swaley areas, because these are really nice, has really great soils, what they call first-rate soils. They're really black and nutritious, because in like peat soils that you really want to grow things on, because it grows things like crazy, and you never really have to uh, pay it much attention. It always has nutrients. So, but the problem is it rained so much in Oregon that it kept on flooding out their fields, and they were very upset about this. And so what they did is they attracted investors that with lots of money to come into the area. These brothers called the Hayes brothers from California. They came in with some fortunes of their own. They bought 1,000 acres at the lake at $1 an acre, and they put $150,000 of their own money into building a ditch from the lake all the way to the Willamette River, all the way far to the left, or the west over here. And that's a 6 mile. It took them 2 years to build this 6 mile trench. In the meantime, other drain fields are put in, and they eventually, by 1918, had enough drainage that they called the lake drained. It took another few decades of more, damming and pumping and stations and things they put in to really truly drain the lake off. But at least the farmers weren't losing all their crops every year at that point, and people moved into the area. They claimed all this area, and it became all cropland. And I'll show you some pictures of that in a minute. But they used not just ditching, but they used a system that they call drain tiling. And what this is a series of pipes. Initially, they were ceramic tiles, and now they're plastic piping that you put underground, and you allow the groundwater to filter down into these pipes, and the pipes push the water out to the local ditches and rivers and creeks faster, and it's constantly draining off the land every minute of the year. So so the land, because of the drain tiling that's been put in under it, no longer ponds. It no longer, if the rain comes, that water trickles down through the soils, and it goes right to these pipes, and it goes out to the local rivers. And so we see more arid soils, which is exactly what agriculture wants. So that's the people that don't know what drain tiling is. Here's your little graphic for that. So this is what we have today. We have the Lake Labiche. You can see the lake structure kind of here. These high areas would be the edge of the lake over here on the side, and then when there's down the bottom, and you see the soil in this foreground is very, very dark and black. That's that peat soil we talked about. And so it grows raw walla walla onions really well. They also now grow hazelnuts and blueberries on the lake bed. And the whole place, all the way back for about 10 miles, is just covered with agriculture now. There is no lake. One farmer contacted me after I did this story of how it was drained on my blog site that summer, like 6 months later. He said he had turned some of his property, 70 acres of it, back into a conservation area. He wanted to stop onion farming. He wasn't paying that well anymore. So he called me back, and last winter I went to see, and and we'd had enough rain that the water stuck around on his property long enough to recreate parts of the lake. So I was really interested in this because we haven't seen the lake like this for more than 100 years. And so he is now in the midst of destroying a lot of the drain fields, drain tiling on his property, so the water sticks around longer, so the wildlife can actually take advantage of it. And we're starting to see some advantages to that because, we want to sort of do what we can to restore parts of our landscape. He told me about these 4 patches of wapato that were growing back that he never planted. It came back by itself. So we think there's something of a seed bank in the soil here that if you leave it alone long enough, the native plants come back. And so this wapato now is completely covering the lake bed. And I believe in 5 years, we'll see a complete carpet of wapato across the lake. And this is where your wapato, it's starting to get big. It's only a few years old, but in around September is a time to go harvest this wapato. Next summer, we're going to, for the first time, go off to the older patches of wapato and do a full harvest so we have enough to actually have a meal. Right now, we really don't have that yet, but we're letting it kind of grow and get bigger and propagate well before we begin harvesting it. But next summer, I believe we will have enough to start harvesting it well. So this is very encouraging to us because I know that this Lake Labiche area was a place that the Calapooians used. Lake areas are always super wealthy with resources for food. And so the Chimeka people in the area, the Chemawa people in the area, and the Malala people in the area all came to this lake to harvest wapato and probably camas, and then gather things like tule and cattail for weaving projects and things. And do a lot of hunting. I mean, there's records of lots and lots of wildlife and waterfowl and other plants in this lake at the time before it was destroyed. So that's enheartening. And then I followed my research up with another story of draining, what I call draining Wapato Lake, another lake system just north of us in the Washington County, just south of Hillsboro, at a place called Gaston, Oregon. This place was called Wapato Lake for a reason. There were vast amounts of Wapato there. The same brothers, or one of them at least, after he made a lot of money on that first project, Lake Labiche, they sold out some of their property, probably a very high return after it became first-rate soil, after it being worthless soil. And then he bought another 800 acres at Wapato Lake, and they did the same thing. They dug a trench to the north, to the Tualatin River, and by 1935, they had the lake drained. And then we see this lake, again, the blue, and then the yellow area was all the swale area that goes off into the hills. That was kind of a wetland, upland swale. This is not a picture from the lake, but the stories go that there was full of wapato, that the Tualatin came here every year and harvested lots of wapato. That there was also tens of thousands of dabbler ducks that came to this lake to as part of their flight down south and up north. They apparently had massive flocks, maybe hundreds of thousands of birds move through this lake every year, enough so that the white farmers from Portland would come down here and set up duck blinds around the lake and shoot them in the lake every weekend. And the farmers were only upset because a lot of times they would leave the ducks dying in the lake and never pick them up. And so they said it was just smelled really bad after that. So um, anyway, that gives us a big hint as to what the culture was like here. Not just Wapato, but lots and lots of perhaps hunting for waterfowl would be part of the Calipuyan diet there. And we do know that the Tualatans, they really revered the lake and wanted it as a resource because we have a little map here on the left side. This is a map from the 1851 treaty map. Shows the lake underneath it, and on top it has what they want as their reservation. And they wanted it as a permanent reservation forever. Let me see. A permanent reservation. And they never got it because it was never ratified, but that's what they wanted. So that means that that was a very significant resource for them. And we now know that we should honor that lake. And the tribe actually today is in the midst of helping the U.S. Forest Service with restoring the lake and is planting Wapato back in the lake today. So these two projects and other things, I was looking for more evidence of how water moved in the valley, of how much wetland was in the valley. And let's see, did I skip one? Okay, so, and I was wondering, like, what is the connection with wetlands and Camas? What is the connection, how much of the Camas territory in the plains of the Willamette Valley was actually a wetland area? So looking again at the GLO maps, I was able to find areas in the valley that were named for the Camas by surveyors. This is one from 1852 that shows an area near Rickreall they called it a wet Camas prairie. And so this huge area right here at a place we now know as Basket Slough was a huge wet Camas prairie. That's one. And then we go to the Central Valley here on the left-hand side. It shows Miry Swamp or Slough up near Woodburn, and we have Lake Labiche, like we just saw. And we have what I wrote Poison. I think it's actually Poisson Lake or Fish Lake down by Mount Angel. And then over in the Tualatin Valley, we have other large wetland areas that are coming out of the Coast Range. These are all the yellow things that were called swamps that actually took up a huge area of the valley because those coastal swamps were basically drowning parts of the valley for much of the year. One of them is so big that they couldn't even destroy it. It's now called Killen Wetlands Nature Park, and you drive right through it on your way to the coast. So it's still there today. So there's those two up north, or on the central and north, and then down south. Okay, we have uh, this huge wetland structure out south of what's called Marysville here on the map, but that's actually Corvallis, Oregon today. All this blue streaky area here on the right hand side is that area on the left. That's all called wet prairie, and I would bet everything I have that there was actually major amounts of camas in this prairie too, because that's actually where the camas rose today. We have lots and lots of basically scattered fields of camas in the area when it's not being plowed up by farmers. So that's around Corvallis. That's a lot of area around Corvallis that was camas. And then south of Eugene, Springfield, there's another place they called Camas Swale. This giant swale complex. Whoops, do it again. What's it doing? Okay, stop. Oh my God. All right. This giant swale complex here that fills up much of one whole map and goes on to another one. that we actually have ethnography about, where people knew that that Native people were gathering camas from that camas swale. It's still there, actually. There's actually a sign on the highway, I-5, that says camas swale right there. So it's still a thing today. It's so big. So this suggested to me, all this research suggested to me that wetlands are actually a pretty significant part of our whole environment. And then going even back further into the 1841 U.S. Exploring Corps, and also called the Wilkes Expedition, we see the notations about there being a thing called Lake La Malie, 80 feet in width and 3/4 mile in length, and about a foot deep, at what is now the Long Tom River, kind of near probably the junction of the Long Tom and Willamette rivers. And so this would be a giant swale ponding complex that actually had a name, Lake La Malie. And so we have then some confirmation that it was actually a pretty common in the area. From these same journal notes, there had been some rainfall a couple days earlier, and so quite interesting to be able to confirm that the wetland was actually a regular occurrence in the valley before colonization farmers took over. My own research into a place called Minto Brown Park near here in Salem shows a field they call Farm Field, which is I believe was one of Minto's major fields. He was a very early settler that brought sheep and the fairgrounds to Oregon. Here we have juncus growing. This is a major weaving plant for the Calipuians, perhaps their only plant they wove, and then camas in the foreground. And then one season in 2002 in May, after a rainfall, this developed. So this is actually that same ponding action we've been talking about, the swale ponding action that is the native landscape, that is the native environment for our valley. We should see this more often, all throughout the valley, and we don't, because the farmers have put in ditching and drain tiling all throughout the valley. So, but this field predated all that, and so we still see it in this field. And 2 days later, it's gone. So that's the action of the valley. The water does trickle away, but it's a slow trickle away if you don't have the drain tiling in there. We also know, I also was very interested in early records of the burning. And I know cultural burning has become a larger part of what we're doing today in terms of like tribal restoration of our areas. We know that all tribes burned and prepared the land for the next season, kind of renewed the land in some respect. And in 1841, these same surveyors, the Wilkes expedition, collected information about there being burning in the valley. They attribute it to the Calipuians, and it actually gives us this August 11th quote here gives us some context as to what it looked like. All the prairie west of us was burnt, and it contrasted strongly with the green patches of woods and narrow belts bordering the stream. So the green patches of woods may have been a moisture sink where these annual sort of summer rains would stay around in the moisture sinks in the woods on the edges of the prairies, and it would stop the fire. It would burn through these bordering woods, narrow belts of woods, and so that's very interesting. So they actually create a system. Calipuians create a system where the prairies were completely devoid of probably wood, probably like trees. They were had camas and other plants in them they used, maybe tarweed they harvested from, and only on the edges of the creeks and the rivers were these patches of woods that would serve as fire breaks. So they could easily and safely burn the valley at any time and it would only burn through the prairies. It wouldn't burn through everything. It wouldn't be destructive. So that is quite interesting to understand more about. So nowadays we are doing a lot of experiments on setting fires in Oregon to, number one, learn more about that, because again, much of our people were assimilated and lost their knowledge of these things. And number two, to basically teach and train our white uh, conspirers in this action, that this is a safe activity, to show communities in our area that we can actually burn as a prevention of perhaps wildfire, and as a way to restore environments. And it's not going to destroy everything, not their houses, not their neighborhoods. So that is part of what we're doing here, and sort of relearning the benefits of fire that the Calapuyans and other tribes knew for a very long time already. And so we have to relearn all that stuff. So I'm wondering, if tribes are mainly working on cultural burning, and we know that some of the agricultural colonization of our land by ditching and drain tiling has spread well beyond the Willamette Valley for the last 100 years. It's all throughout the world. I believe that every valley that is an agricultural valley in our areas that have lots of water probably have drain tiling or ditching to some effect, so they can control how much water there is in any area. I know this is the case in California, likely in Washington State, and everywhere else there's a lot of rainfall or too much rainfall parts of the year for farmers. And so, but in our valley here, the Willamette Valley, we have such a unique valley, like a rainforest type Mediterranean environment, that our plants here probably adapted to an environment that was wetland a good portion of the year, probably half or more of the year, and then people would set fire to that in August, September, and it would burn over the wetland. And so there has to be some equation that we have to figure out to make that work in our valley. We can't use the same uh, processes they may use in California. They have a different environment there. We have to understand our valley more, how water worked in our valley, how our plants like camas and wapato and tarweed and other plants are adapted to a wetland environment in this valley, and how what's the proper use of fire in that environment. And so that's, I guess, my task for the next few years, to sort of figure more out about that, and do some studies, and to figure out what is that equation, and then actually throw a little wrench into that equation by saying, and what about climate change as well? And so we know that we're much warmer today than we were 100 years ago or 200 years ago. And so when you add climate change in there, I think that's going to change our original equation from maybe a picture 100 to 150 years ago to something different. And so we need to figure that out as well. Because if we're going to restore the parts of the valley, we need to have a way to bring back water, because water, just like fire, was made an enemy of civilization. Fire was discouraged. Water was also heavily discouraged and actually destroyed. It moved out to the ocean faster than ever before. To the point where nowadays, even though we have tons of rainfall in Oregon, every summer I see in the newspaper and news reports something about a drought, and I always wonder about that. And now I know why, because they actually put in the systems to move water out to the ocean faster than it should, and there's been nothing to sort of replace that. There's no way to return the water back to the ground where it should be residing in for longer periods of time. So while we work on and other issues, what we work on in many tribes working on destroying dams as a way to bring back salmon. Well, that is one thing we need to do, absolutely. But in the upper areas where the salmon actually spawn, like in the upper Willamette River, on the McKenzie, on the Coast Fork, on the Middle Fork, on the Santiam, on the Lucky Mute, on the Long Tom, these are all areas that were heavily affected or have been heavily affected by draining and ditching and drain tiling. And so the environments for the salmon to spawn in are a lot worse than they ever were. So we also need to work on these upper areas to restore the spawning beds, the spawning areas for these salmon, because we've basically destroyed the water health for them, and part of that is all the ditching and drain tiling that's happened up here. So these are all, I know I've complicated the issue quite a bit by throwing water into this issue, but as we all know, among tribes, water is very important. It's a sacred thing. We all come from water. Much of our resources come from water environments, and as if we're going to return fire, we need to return water too. It's just something we have to do for the health of the community and our own cultural health as tribal people. So in my picture here, I drew some water into the picture, so because a lot of our descriptions of the Calapuyans, are of them harvesting camas from prairies, and I want to change that description to be harvesting camas from wet prairies, because that is their true thing they did. My mission as an anthropologist to figure out what the original culture was like. Uh, in the meantime, I've had to figure out how the original conditions and culture were changed, but I think the original Kalapuya culture was adapted to a predominantly wetland environment much of the year, and and that may be the case with many tribes across the Americas. So, and their conditions have been changed radically. So that's I'm kind of at the end of everything that and there. I could probably go on to questions. I wanted to say goodbye, thank you, and thanks for the invite and the ability to tell the story here.
Hey, thank you so much for this presentation. I think it's always been eye-opening. It's been a pleasure to listen to you and how and the ways that your tribes are beginning to find ways back to the original ecologies and what that could mean. We'll connect with you in the future for our Lifeways project, I think, because what you're saying is such a good example of how things can be done. We also have some very good questions. And I think I'll turn this over to Polly now to continue. We have some that people send in, and then we've just received about 6 or 7 questions that are even better than what we had earlier. So I'll turn it over to you, Polly.
First, before I begin with the questions, David, I'd like to say, Wado, thank you. I'm very grateful for what you shared today, and I was particularly moved by your story of the return of the Wapato all by itself, without any human intervention. And it made me think of the webinar that Robin Wall Kimmerer did with us about the intelligence and the teachings of the plants and how much we have to learn from the Wapato and the Kama. So I just wanted to say that from a personal note. And I'll field some of the questions from the audience. The first one is a question from early on in your presentation, and said, when you say non-intelligible languages, what does that mean exactly?
I was talking about the Umpqua Basin, and in that basin we have what's called the Upper Umpqua, the Kalapuya, or Yoncalla Kalapuya, Molalla, Cow Creek Umpqua, Upper Coquel. So all those languages are not even in the same family. So they're non, if somebody from Molalla spoke to somebody in the Upper Umpqua, they couldn't understand each other. So they had to sort of probably go through intermediaries, relatives that were married in from various tribes. to understand each other or use something like Chinookwawa to speak with each other. But that's a very interesting situation in the Umpqua Valley to have 5 non-intelligible languages in the same basin.
Absolutely. Most of the other questions are, well, let me do the other couple of language questions first. One question is, could you share some of the native names for these beautiful lands, rivers, and plants?
We generally really didn't have names for the lands and the rivers. Calipuans didn't name their rivers. I think most people we only name things like mountains and stuff. So we have some place names for villages, and so those are pretty well known. Think places like Chemeketa and Chemawa and Champui and Chehalem. Those are all place names. Sometimes they are built on the resource, like Champui actually is built upon this idea of the place of the champuik, or the now we call it biscuit root or limatium plant in other languages. So that's kind of the way it was. Generally, we called the Willamette River the Big Water. Literally, that's what it's called. And the Willamette is not its original name. The Willamette comes from a village up near what's called Milwaukee today. So yeah, so a lot of these names have been imposed by settlers based on the local tribal name that they had. Yeah.
Thanks for that clarification. We have another question about restoration of land. It says, is the landowner compensated somehow for restoring the land? If so, how do we promote that for further restoration?
The landowner at Lake LaBiche was he did probably a lot of research in getting sort of ducks unlimited and various restoration type funds in on his project. He's got a big plaque that shows all all the different funds he got from different people to different organizations to restore land for waterfowl flyover and for conservation. He said he actually made as much money doing that as onion farming, and then they pay him a stipend to be the caretaker of his own land. So that's that is a pretty good model. May take a little bit of grant writing to happen, but that is a pretty good model.
It's an awesome model. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Another question, do you think using Earth observation satellite data might be part of your conservation restoration?
It's possible. If we wanted to know the extent of drain tiling and ditching and stuff like that in various areas, I think that would be great. I'm finding it hard right now to find numbers. How much drain tiling has been put into the valley. For the longest time, they didn't really track that very much. But I'm hoping to find some organization out there that has maps of where the drain tiles are put in. It is a difficult process to destroy them. You have to get a trencher to go out there to run through these where the drain tiles are, because it's not easy to sort of just unearth them once they've been put in the soil. But you can do it. That's what he's been doing. He's been running trenchers through these drain tiles and destroying their ability to run water out to the local creek fast. So, but if we want to know more of the extent of the problem, it would be great to sort of study some maps to see what's going on. Sure. But I haven't gone that far into that yet.
That's fascinating. And while we're on the topic of maps, we have another question related. Are the maps that you've been showing in your talk today, are they included in your book?
Probably not. Some of this stuff I have just discovered in the last few years and didn't make the book. I am I am playing with that idea of writing an environmental history of the valley, and clearly this kind of stuff would appear in the book. Absolutely, sure.
And for the person who asked that question, we do post these webinars on our Indigenous Education Institute site, so you can return to these maps that David shared today through that method. We have a question here about our more than human relatives. How might the removal of beaver have affected the change in water retention on the land? Were beaver in the valley? And how would returning the beaver be part of restoration efforts?
Yeah, one more piece on that last thing. I mean, most of the maps I've gotten are from the General Land Office maps, and they're actually freely available online for anybody to download and get to. So I actually just took a couple of maps and I just jammed them together using Photoshop and stuff to sort of make larger maps. On to beaver issues. Yeah, so beavers were one of the major resources in the valley. And you know, the Hudson's Bay Company was here, Northern Fur Traders were here, collecting beavers and other small animal pelts for quite a while, some 30 or 40 years. And so it was a major resource in the area. So I have got that question about returning beavers. The problem is right now, most farmers are not going to really like having water returned to the land. So until we have a policy or something that allows water to be returned, I don't think they're going to stomach beavers returning. Because that's what beavers do. They actually create large ponds of water, which can invade, farmers' fields and stuff. And so they would probably shoot the beavers. I mean, it doesn't matter how much they're protected. They would probably get rid of them in some way, poison them or shoot them or whatever. And so I would guess that we probably need to deal with kind of the criminalization of water in the valley, in a sense, be first and allow certain areas of the valley to have water returned to it and we have areas of standing water before we bring beaver back in a big way. Yeah.
That's fascinating. I love that term you use, the criminalization of water. That's a
Yeah.
very for what's happening. Another
Yeah.
question: are there organizations you would like to highlight in this work of returning to water?
Um, are you saying the organizations I want to highlight?
Yeah, this person says, are there organizations? I suppose other organizations that are working to return water to land.
Yeah, I think I mean, recently I think the Forest Service and like even the United Nations has raised the issue of the loss of wetlands internationally. I think they're probably 80 to 100 years too late, but yeah, they've said we're down to a small fraction of where our wetlands are originally in the Americas and worldwide, and we're losing wetlands every year, and so it's a huge problem that we need to deal with at some point. Otherwise, we're going to start to lose much more diversity of species than we ever had before. So hopefully we can reverse some of that. But I don't really have any necessarily organizations that are working on that. I just see reports appearing. I know there's a United Nations report that says that if we want to save our species on the Earth, we need to save 1/3 of our land for as native landscapes. And we need to really work with organizations that are preserving and saving and maybe bringing back wetlands as much as possible. I haven't worked with any organizations yet. This is my own research. I'm working a little bit with Water Resources program at OSU. Hopefully that can springboard some of this research into water issues in the valley because I think it's pretty significant and I don't think we understand how significant it is yet.
Absolutely. Another different topic from what we've covered in the question so far. Then this person says, what a tragedy when 80% or more of the people were lost to disease. So much native knowledge was lost too. Do you have any fragments of that left? Or are you having to rely on surveyors' notes to pull together that older record?
Actually, I've been, my 25 years of studying the tribes here has been in the ethnography and in the settlers' journals and letters and stuff from the early Oregon settlers. But the ethnographers and anthropologists did collect a lot of stuff. Linguists collect a lot of stuff, and we've been going through much of that. I've seen most of it. Probably need to go through it all again at some point, but I'm just looking at other, from my research, I have some suspicious ideas about the valley in that area, and so now I'm reaching out for other data points, and the other data points would be the environment itself. The land itself is a record of our people. And if it doesn't, if today it doesn't look like it used to look, then how was it changed? Which I'm trying to figure out, and then that gives us a record then of what we need to return it back to, if we can figure out how and why it was changed, and the how and why, I think there are really significant issues in Oregon. There were, back when this is all happening, under what's called the Willamette Valley Project, when they're putting dams in the periphery of the valley, and there was some money allowed for farmers to do drain tiling and ditching in the valley to control the water. There was nobody to speak for the valley. There was nobody to speak for the plants, for the animals. The native people were put on reservations and were disempowered by federal policies, federal processes, by basically calling them non-citizens, non-Americans for the longest time. And there was one there's one naturalist in the whole valley that spoke for these things. William Finley has a park about him, in the valley. He was a pretty significant naturalist, early naturalist. He's the only one I found in all my research to say, hey, if you destroy all the water in the valley, you're going to destroy the environment for the ducks. And he liked birds, so, and he's the only one that said anything about that. And everybody else was like, well, that's all worthless land. We need to destroy it. We need to turn it into farms, because that's a better use of that land. And even today, I have not heard anybody yet breach even possibly going and talking to the farmers about what they've done to the land in Oregon.
Mm. Lots of work remains to be done.
Yeah.
Another participant asks, I wanted to ask if you're familiar with the theory of social ecology. If so, I'm curious to ask how you think it relates to tribal methodologies of ecological restoration and environmental decolonization.
I'm somewhat familiar with social ecology. I don't use that very often. I'm doing more ethnography in my work. It could relate. I would probably have to refamiliarize myself with theories again. It's been some time since I studied social ecology theory. But yeah, I've been really kind of focused on the history and ethnography of the tribes. Because for me, that's fundamental to understanding, where we are today. So.
And we have a couple of questions about camas that I'm going to put together. Does camas grow only on the West Coast, and does it require wet conditions?
I don't think it requires that. I've seen it growing in kind of dry areas. I've seen it up in the mountains. I've seen it. I think there are varieties that grow around all across the United States. But it seems like apparently I've read some of the early papers on camas, and I believe right now scholars think it actually originally developed in Southern Oregon, Southwestern Oregon, and then it spread out from there. There are varieties in California. There's lots of varieties in the Northwest. Oregon has numerous varieties, numerous different strains. It's up in British Columbia, so it's really everywhere on the West Coast. I think there are varieties across the United States, though. Although I haven't really investigated much beyond, the West Coast. So.
Thank you. Next question is, thank you for the maps of the tribal homelands at the beginning of the presentation. Do you recommend, and they cite a website here, it's the nativeland.ca as a resource for further explanation? Why or why not?
I don't. I mean, there's a couple different maps out there like this. Some are created by Native people, but they're not that good. They just aren't. I mean, because generally what happens is somebody from the East Coast or somewhere else is creating this map. They're not an expert on tribal territories, and they're just creating a map, and they're not, so they don't really know like much about Oregon, and so they place the names of the tribes in the wrong places. And so they are then miseducating people by using the maps. The other thing is that native maps layer has various layers in it. And I've seen it, and I've seen my students use it, and they are being miseducated by that, because what happens is if you're getting the layer from a tribe, and the tribe has some political ambitions to expand their area like they do, they will, if you put that on a national map, you're going to miseducate people about what the actual tribal area is, because they're not, it isn't detailed on that map where that layer comes from and why they created that layer. So it's really important to understand those things, that those data points about the how and the why. Sometimes that those layers are created for, let's say, tribal gaming, areas, or where they would like to go fishing, not necessarily where they actually did fish, things like that. So no, I recommend people getting more detailed ethnographic accounts of, and or maybe anthropological accounts of the tribes, so that you can get the actual territories of the tribes where they went, and then listen to their stories and stuff like that. But don't trust those maps. I wonder nowadays if they're even being informed by AI, and so if that's the case, then that's a huge misinformation, because that's where you're going to go. That's where they're going to go with it. They're going to start reaching out in a broad spectrum to gather data, and they're basically not really, very critical of the data, and they just bring it in, and they're not telling you why the data is there.
That's very concerning to think about AI being in the middle of what's already a very complex.
Ask that question. I haven't asked the native maps people that question yet, but like, for example, I asked the people in my classes, my students, is to do a little essay on the original place they grew up in, what tribe lived there. Some people grew up in like the Tualatin Valley around Hillsboro and stuff, and they go to the that native map thing, and you look at the layer above Tualatin, and it says the Walla Walla and Cayuse people, and that's not true at all. So that's complete miseducation, especially from those students that don't know better, that don't really know how to do the research on that. They're being completely miseducated.
Thank you for that. And Nancy, I'm just going to touch base with you. It's 18 minutes after 2. We do have other questions that we haven't brought up yet, but where do we stand on where we need to wrap up?
Well, I see that over almost 160 people are still on. They haven't dropped off. So I'm thinking maybe David, if you have time, we could take
I'm
a
good.
few
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah. I can
Usually
ask.
we get a big drop off after an hour, but in this case, people are staying on and are really engaged. And also there's a lot of in the chat too, David, and some of it I think is aimed at you, people that have written in. I have just one thing to add and then go back to your questions, Polly, is because you did bring up AI. The latest issue of the Tribal College Journal featured a very interesting article from Dene College, which is where I went, which I graduated from and worked with later. But they came up with an article on AI and traditional values, and how they are trying to tie the two together. And so there, you can Google Tribal College Journal, and the article is which is the Navajo, the students. They're very impressive mini articles that were published concerning AI, and it was really really makes you think of what the kind of things you just said, Polly and David, about AI, and what these students were saying too, how they could reconcile these ways of knowing.
Fascinating. Have to have a look at that. Okay, returning to the questions, David. One participant asks, perhaps LiDAR observations with a drone would be helpful to observe the tiling? ?
Yeah, I don't know if they show up on LiDAR. I know that old roads do that. You can see places where there's been landslides and things like that. It's possible. I don't know. We probably need a pretty fine detail, sort of fine mesh detail LiDAR to get that data. I'm not that good with computers, so if somebody has uh, a grad student that's a good computer programmer, maybe they could do a project on that and get a master's degree on that or something. But I did inspire though a student through PSU to do work with LiDAR to figure out where the Calapooya Mountains may be. And they did figure out that there is a way to use the LiDAR data to find the Calapooya Mounds that are remaining on the landscape, which are these low mounds that the Calapooyans created that are about 10 to 15 feet high, and so they were able to determine how to do that. And I figured that out kind of like organically. I'm like, hey, we could use LiDAR to find our mounds, and so and they did that. They proved it. So they're more of a mathematician than I am on that, but yeah, that is something that we perhaps could do. I'm looking at the NRCS data place now, like suggested, and I think that may be a good place to turn to for more information too. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so a couple of other suggestions and comments. This one says, just a comment, local soil and water conservation districts would likely be a good resource for finding out more about the extent of agricultural drain tiles, as they work closely with farmers in their districts. And then also a comment from the same person, and it would be amazing to read an environmental history of the Willamette Valley.
Right, is one actually out there. I have it, and the problem is that environmental history only goes back to the 1960s. So I'm it's not really that much history. I'm just saying, I'm not trying to be heavily critical, but really 1960s is not much history. So, and that's the case with a lot of things. I've seen studies of various lakes and things, and they go back to maybe the 1960s, and before that, they kind of run out of data or something, and so, or they didn't do the research well. And so that's been a problem. So there's not an older uh, study or a study that goes back to older dates into the 19 or 1850s or 1840s or anything like that I've seen yet.
From a different participant, says the recovery of Wapato and the Labish Lake bed is really inspiring. Do you know if anyone is studying probable seed bank locations along relict streams and marshes in the Willamette Valley to reconstruct historic plant communities?
I mean, I think some students are kind of starting to get interested in that. We have, like last summer, I had a student working under some federal funds to do research with about one plant, and I inspired him to do Wapato, and he started going up streams and finding populations of Wapato, uh, and doing much more research on that. And he may do more with that later on, but he found Wapato in places I didn't even know where it grew. So yeah, so we are starting to inspire that. I'm trying to inspire that among students that come to me and ask me for a project. Get them to sort of begin working on these problems of reconstructing what things were like, and then how things have been changed since then. Once we understand more about how things have been changed, we can perhaps begin to deconstruct all that stuff and then reverse it. Oh, sorry, I saw the Calapooya Mound thing that somebody put the link on. That's great. Yeah.
Another participant says, have you considered looking at the pollen record in your quest to reconstruct the recent environmental and ecological history of the area?
Yeah, there's been some work on that. It's usually older, and they only really get the pollen records from pond and lake beds right now, under the assumption, I guess, that much of the other record has been destroyed by agriculture, by putting in the drain tiling, which has destroyed a good 2 feet or more, or 3 feet of soil depth. We are doing, like I did this summer, we did like some coring of Lake Labish, and we need to get some money together to hire somebody to do a pollen count on the various layers of that core, those cores that we got. And we think we actually have the coring, we have 15 feet, so we think we are below Missoula floods. So if that's the case, we may be able to figure out what the environment was like before the floods, and then compare that with the after part of the core, and then figure out how it's changed. And so if we do that enough throughout the valley, we can probably figure more things out about the valley than we have today. Because right now, archaeologists are not going below the Missoula floods, because in many areas of the valley, the flood layers, the soils are like 100 feet deep. So there is no money for that kind of research right now.
Have
Uh,
you reached out to any of the other local tribes along the Columbia River for going below the Missoula flood? What happened to them? Because I understand that a couple of them have been working on some of those.
I haven't, but they have a completely different environment too. They have see the floodwaters, according to the theory, is that the floodwaters came into the valley and then settled in the valley, and then gradually sort of like petered out to the Columbia and the Pacific. But and that's way different from Eastern Oregon, where there was no settling of water or anything.
Hmm.
So we actually, the flood soils from the Missoula floods are actually stolen from Eastern Washington. So their scab lands are because of Missoula floods. Um, so, but I haven't really thought about reaching out to them about their environment. I mean, their pollen issues, or what their environments were like. I have thought about things like our buttes in the valley, which are above the flood line, because the floods only came in at about 40 or 400 feet. So many of the buttes in the valley, we have quite a few buttes in the valley, are upwards of 1,200 feet and stuff. And so we could so that the tops of those buttes then perhaps have an older soil signature, that and the problem is they're all pretty much owned privately. So, and I've asked people about the research on them, and nobody really has done much research on them at all. So we would have to get a lot of like private arrangements up there, like geologists, soil scientists, water scientists, archaeologists up there to look at things. We have found a few things, like on Peterson Butte, the one I took a picture from. There is a wall up there that we think is trebly made. So
That's fascinating.
yeah.
We have a question on a very different topic. How are you teaching data literacy to your students?
Data literacy. Well, I think I sort of stumble over that all the time, because most of the problem is, as you guys all probably guess, most students nowadays are born digital, and so they don't understand that much of the digital content they have is a political construct, and so they don't understand that a good portion of the data is not actually online; it's somewhere else, like in a library or something. So so I do presentations about what to trust and what not to trust online. And even then, they don't really understand. I mean, they don't. When I say that you can't really trust the essays online unless they have um, an author, and then they have a bibliography, and then they're in some sort of reputable kind of format. They don't really understand what that means. So, and it's a problem. I think a lot of, now we bring AI into the picture, that's a problem too. So yeah. So we're almost getting to the point where we have to pull everybody off from online altogether, and just say use the library, use the published journals, because you almost can't trust anything now online.
And
Yeah.
Nancy, I'm checking again. We're now at 12:30. Would this be a good place for us to wrap up? We do have other questions, but I'm thinking of the length of our presentation. Or should we go on?
I'll leave it to, I'm fine with going on. We can check with Chris how his time is, and David, especially yours.
I can do 2 more questions. How about that?
Okay, that's good.
This next one says, do you work with the Institute for Applied Ecology? It's a great resource for ecological work.
I don't. It's been suggested of me. I haven't been working with any kind of institutes at all because I'm doing stuff out there independently a lot, and I'm just kind of finding my way through the stuff, and I'm just now beginning to get into a lot of these environmental issues where I need more help. And so I think that I will in the future, but right now I've been trying to stick with the path of getting tenure first, and then doing something else later on. So
Yeah.
Those who've been through that are laughing. So
yeah,
it's quite the process. Yes.
yeah.
There's a question here I find really interesting. The background of some of my work is this: is there any fiction from the 1800s about the area that describes the landscape pre-drainage?
Yeah, there's some. Not. I mean, Oregon was settled mainly in the 1840s and later, so there are a couple of fictional accounts that written about about the time period, but not in that time period.
Mm.
We really didn't get much fiction here, except for maybe poetry, until much later. So we do have some histories of Oregon that began being published in the 1850s, which had to be very short, because not much Oregon going on yet. So, but yeah. So I mean, there are some fictions that begin in the late 19th, early 20th century, I think 1888 and later. A guy named Frederick Balch began publishing in the 1880s, 1890s. He published a book called Bridge of the Gods. Uh, and he calls it a fiction. And what's funny about that book is it was so influential in the time period that people began believing it as true.
Mm.
And they held for like 40 years. There was reprints of the book. Somebody created a play. People began he created people inside the book that were fictional. People believe they still exist, and it was picked up by, I mean, some of the themes in the book were picked up by like Multnomah County and used as symbols for parking and stuff. So it's very weird, but people were taught the book as if it was true. uh, so it's very, very odd. It's kind of this example of sort of romanticist fiction that we all know and love from Native studies.
Was such a rich presentation, interesting questions, and I really appreciate your taking the time to draw on your knowledge and expertise to answer them.
Well,
Thank you.
thank you, Polly, for your good questions. Excellent. And thank you,
Yeah.
David, for your answers. This has been a really rich and rewarding question and answer period. I think we'll put this to a close. I want to tell you, we have been recording almost all of the speakers' presentations, and they are all available on our IEI website, which is www.indigenouseducation.org/multimedia, if you go there. And the recordings will contain the entire webinar, and there's no cost to download them. We've learned that many teachers and professors are downloading the recordings and using them in their classrooms as a valuable curriculum resource, all the way out to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and community colleges. So in closing, I want to extend a very special thank you to our technical support, Chris Tarrant of Tarrant Solutions, Friday Harbor, Washington. Each time we host one of these speakers, there's so much work that goes on behind the scenes. The coyote factor, which is a Navajo disruptor and bringer of chaos, is always lurking somewhere. And Chris is the one who always comes up with a plan B or plan C to counter the possible chaos. Also want to give a shout out to Ashley Tarrant, who creates our beautiful posters. We will be sending an email out to you all in the audience just after this presentation with a very short survey asking your reaction to what you have heard today. And I would ask you to please take the time to answer the questions, because your responses are really helpful to us to inform our future program design. And with that said, from all of us to all of you, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Wado, ahiehe, and gracias.